The Craigslist ad had been up for 3 days when Mark finally got a response. The guy's name was Derek, said he was quiet, worked from home and didn't party. That was good enough for Mark. He didn't need a best friend, just someone to split the rent. The apartment was too expensive for one person, and Mark was tired of eating ramen and dodging late fees. Derek moved in that weekend carrying nothing but a single duffel bag. He was thin, too thin, and pale like he hadn't been outside in years. His hands were long, bony, and always fidgeting. His handshake was cold, his grip weak. His voice, when he spoke at all, was barely above a whisper. At first, Mark thought he'd lucked out. Derek was quiet, paid rent on time, and mostly kept to himself. But after a week, things started to feel wrong. For one, Derek never left. Ever. Mark worked long shifts at the bar downtown, and every time he came home, Derek was there, sitting in his room, door slightly ajar, staring at the wall. He didn't cook, do laundry. And he never showered. Then came the whispering. It started around 2 a.m. Low, murmuring voices seeping through the walls. Mark assumed he was on the phone, but the more he listened, the more it didn't make sense. There were no pauses, no responses, just a breathy monologue. One night, Mark pressed his ear to the wall trying to listen. His stomach twisted. It wasn't English. Hell, it wasn't even a language. Just wet, rasping syllables that made his skin crawl. Then came the kitchen incident. It was almost 3 a.m. when Mark got home from work. The place was dark except for the pale blue glow of the fridge. Derek was standing there, barefoot, the fridge door wide open. He wasn't eating or drinking, just standing, watching. Mark swallowed. "Hey, man, you good?" Derek smiled, and it felt wrong, like his face wasn't used to the expression. His teeth were too white, too even. His lips stretched just a little too far. Then he said it. "I thought you wouldn't come back." Mark barely slept that night. He'd made up his mind. Derek had to go. He called the landlord, explaining he wasn't comfortable with his roommate. The landlord listened quietly. Then, after a pause, he said something that turned Mark's stomach inside out. "Mark, you don't have a roommate." Mark let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, Derek, he moved in 2 weeks ago." The landlord sighed. "Mark, you've been the only tenant for over a year." Mark hung up and ran to Derek's room. His hand shook as he turned the knob. Empty. No furniture or clothes. No bag, nothing. Like no one had ever lived there. Mark stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to tell himself he was losing it. That he'd imagined everything until he saw it. A single Polaroid tucked into the doorframe. It was a photo of him, asleep in his bed. In the corner of the photo, just barely visible, was a shadowy figure. A smudge of ink covered the back. 4 words, shaky, smudged. "You let me in."